As technology automates some work, it's creating new types of work that depend on human expertise. And if you think about this, this runs counter to everything we've heard over the last few years about artificial intelligence. The robots are not on the rise. And in fact, they're opening up these new places for particular kinds of work. And we shouldn't think of this as a new moment so much as part of a lineage of what we're going to talk about as ghost work today. It began as early as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution with something called piecework. So thinking of moments when the textile mills could produce a shirt, could mass produce shirts for many, but what it couldn't accomplish was adding a bow or a flourish of some kind to the shirt. That you could depend on that final piece of work that could not be done by a machine. You could depend on family farms that surrounded many of the industrial cities that were booming at the time who could complete that work. It was done and paid by the piece. It was considered fairly mundane, routine, brainless, all the sorts of words we might use today for the kind of task-based work we're going to talk about. So what are today's last mile jobs? And this is the world that Sid and I spent several years investigating, that for the average consumer is beyond all of our line of sight. It's a world that involves what's called structuring and cleaning training data. It is a part of training artificial intelligence to replace what humans are doing. It can look like data entry, location verification, which means you're just confirming that the place you just Googled actually is still open down the neighborhood street. It can be data labeling, and we'll talk quite a bit about that. It can be content review, and I'm going to come back to what that means. But there's another stream of work that's being produced by the development of artificial intelligence that's often well beyond what the average consumer sees. And that's this world of human-in-the-loop information services. They're the kinds of startups, in some cases incumbents, who are offering businesses often to other businesses that are about keeping a person in a particular moment. Usually it's about making a snap judgment or offering some sort of insight, responding quickly to a request for help. So when you're on a website and perhaps you're text chatting with someone, you can see a bit of that might be automated text exchange, and then all of a sudden you notice the humanity of a person responding to your query. That's the world of human-in-the-loop information services that is billowing out from the building up of artificial intelligence. And that can look like sales leads generation, which sounds like a boring business, but is actually a fairly thriving area of growth. Content moderation, and things like translation and video captioning, particularly in many languages. Video is technically a very difficult thing to automatically recognize. So these two streams of work are part of this paradox of growing work. And so when you're thinking about this world, some of this may be visible to you, and often we're spending most of our energy talking about a world of online to offline information service work. It looks like Uber, Lyft, Deliveroo, TaskRabbit, places where you're seeing the person who's being called up to deliver a service, often to you, the end consumer, and that call for service to complete a task is happening through the internet. There's another world that's just coming into our line of sight, content moderation. And I can promise you, when we had first started doing this research, I'd say the phrase content moderation. No one knew that could possibly involve another human being. How many of you today know that content moderation involves people? Right? We learned the hard way that that was true. Below the surface of this world of work, it's on-demand, online to online information services. That's much of that second stream of businesses that are constantly trying to figure out, where could I place a person in that loop of computation so they can do the thing that only a human can do, snap judgments in a moment with no prior information. And that's a world of work you can't see. So it runs from incumbents like Accenture, offering data labeling, to U-Haul, that uses human-in-the-loop services to be able to respond quickly to requests for help if you're stuck on the side of the road with your moving van. It's a lot of mundane knowledge work, office work. So when you're thinking about this world, we're not talking about AI and automation creating and then eventually overtaking niche jobs. We're not waiting for automated systems to start delivering us food, so much as we're describing a world of work that is really about this new mechanism. It's dismantling full-time employment. Literally, it's taking over service industries writ large and turning them into task-based, project-based work. And that's the place that AI can't keep up with people. It literally can only go so far, and people step into the maw between what automation can do and what humans do best, which is to be able to respond quickly, spontaneously, and the other things that we're able to do, we can have complex communication. These are the two features that computer scientists identify as technically hard for computation to solve. Why? Because if you don't have a clear yes or no to what you need done, odds are pretty good you can't write a software program that can figure it out. So for much of this conversation about the growth of AI and the overtaking of human jobs, we're forgetting, sometimes we're asking the companies that are selling us the AI. In other cases, we don't have enough of our own training and literacy and understanding what's actually technically hard to automate. It turns out service jobs are really hard to technically automate. So in ignoring the value of the human in the loop, we're replaying this lineage of ghost work, where we're devaluing the people who are stepping in. And in many cases now, we're hiding, actually, the presence of workers who are those humans in the loop who are delivering that moment of intervention to help us out. So just a little bit more to prime you with, how does this actually work? The mechanism I'm describing, it is literally supply-demand. It's a two-sided market with an intermediary. On one side, you've got businesses that are demanding attention with specific tasks. That can be data labeling. I have a bunch of material and I'd like to be able to have a keyword attached to it, to I have some food I'd like to deliver to this address. Those are really the same approach to employment through this mechanism. So this mechanism has businesses on one side saying, I've got this thing I need done, and they're able to now, with application programming interfaces and the internet, put it on a platform and have someone who's signed up through that platform pick up the task. It's quite a novel approach, and computer scientists and engineers call it human computation. It was only introduced in the early 2000s, and it has literally overtaken and created these labor markets that are people standing on call to do project-based work. So when you're thinking about this world of work, in some cases you're hearing companies talk about it as collective intelligence. Sometimes they are referring to human computation. They might call it crowdsourcing. Sometimes they're calling it data analytics. Notice how often you don't hear anything about people doing work. Please don't call it click work. That might be the one term we hear most often. And it suggests that there's something easy about that moment of judgment, that you're just looking at images perhaps and trying to figure out what to label them. I can promise you, after years of studying the people who do this work, it's actually cognitively really draining, because you constantly have to be attending and offering that thing that only humans can offer. That moment of creativity, that moment of insight, snap judgment, and in some cases, communicating with other parties to be able to try and interpret what they're asking for. So our choice of term is really on-demand work for this broader world of employment, and we chose that to be able to talk about that mechanism and then to distinguish it from what happens when you take on-demand work and you sell it as though the people providing the service are somehow ancillary to the value of your company. And importantly, we're talking about anything, so please hold on to this, anything that can be sourced, scheduled, managed, shipped, and billed, at least in part, through application programming interfaces, which are just software, and the internet. That's a lot of work. That's anything that can move through your computer, right? So thinking about this as niche jobs that are a narrow vertical that somehow we'll figure out how to automate, and those are the jobs we should worry about, The argument of this book is actually we should be worried about all of full-time employment that involves any sort of exchange of information and service. So in thinking about this world, realize it's often this blend of human creativity and code that is the value proposition of these companies. But arguably, this can't work at all without people in the loop. We are literally building ourselves into labor markets, into employment that is completely dependent on people and at the same time dependent on their contingency, that they come in and out of a labor market. We've never had to organize valuing employment that wasn't a full-time person on site. So it's a radical reorientation to how to think about the value proposition of what somebody is doing, because in fact, it's rarely about just the one person. It's about a lot of people. It is literally about creating a commons, a worker pool that many companies can draw on for, say, data labeling, for food delivery, for ride-hailing apps, so that many of these companies are drawing from a broader labor pool that is a shared abundance. It's no longer a surplus. It is literally their value, not just as individuals in the moment, but their value of standing in and being available so that you as a consumer, whether you're a consumer individually and you have an app like Uber, or you're a business, that you can open that website or that app and see many people who can serve you. And that it literally gives you reassurance that you can shut your app, walk away for 5 minutes, and you'll see many people when you come back. It's not about surplus, it's about abundance. And we arguably don't have the economic models for how to think about this employment. So in not having the economic models, in being oriented to labor and employment that's full-time, one site, single employer, we're creating ghost work conditions because we don't know how to value many people coming in and out of a market who are in fact valued for the very fact that they're ephemeral, they're ambient to that market. And it sets up this devaluing of people. And in many cases, it allows companies to sell what they sell as the magic of AI or the magic of tech. So keep in mind, these labor markets require a lot of people, this shared abundance, and it's operating like a commons. So the question that we want to pose to you, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss today, is what is it going to take to be able to develop an orientation, a new social contract that supports a commons, that imagines the future of work not as moving back to full-time employment, but literally moving toward providing a way for people to do their work, but also live their lives. So with that, thank you.
Well, let's take a step back and talk about you for a second, since we dove right into the work, which I thought was a really valuable overview, but not quite as valuable as reading the book, which I highly recommend. Tell us your story and why you chose this body of work as your research.
Well, if anybody looks at my previous work, a lot of it had to do with young people in the rural parts of the United States, Southeast Appalachia. So my earliest work was thinking about questions of digital divide, what it means to be marginalized, and trying to access the internet to achieve more visibility, to be seen. And from that work, when I finished that work, in a lot of ways I realized the young people I was working with, what was making their world harder was the lack of economic opportunity. So when I moved to Microsoft Research full-time to do research there, I immediately went to work trying to understand, what is this thing we're all talking about, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence? And when I started asking engineers who were building these platforms, so how does this work? They said, well, we hire these people to do annotation to clean up our data sets, and then we start training our algorithms. And I said, whoa, who are these people that you hired? And I was so struck by their responses. I immediately could see, if you're hiring people, this could be a way, this may sound naive, but this could be a way of providing economic opportunity to young people I met who were living in rural parts of the United States who could not or did not want to leave their hometowns. And the responses I got back were quite chilling. I mean, the initial response was, I don't really know, and we would move on. And they literally didn't quite understand my question, because for them, it was about the final product. They weren't really thinking about who might be participating and helping them create those training data sets. And then I would hear from folks who would say, I don't really know, but I don't need to know. This is the best thing about this technology. And then I met folks who would say, I don't really want to know, because I'm afraid of what it looks like to be doing this work. And I think it was hearing that response, I'm an anthropologist by training, hearing that response and feeling they could be talking about the young people that I just worked with who I hope might be able to benefit from these work opportunities, what it means to be further erased. I felt like it was really important to follow that story. And then Siddharth Suri was one of the first engineers, computer scientists that I met, who said, I don't know who these people are, but I really want to know. Yeah.
Tell us a story, actually. I know you spent a lot of time with these people all over the world, in living rooms all over the world. Tell us about one ghost worker that you talk about in the book.
Yeah. I have a really vivid memory of this family, a woman named Asha, who was this tiny woman in Hyderabad, India. And I hadn't done field work in India before, so the moments of stepping into people's homes and really orienting to their home offices, their families, I had a learning curve. So she invited me into her home, and to see her joy at being able to do a particular kind of work. And when I asked her, why do you do this work? She did content review, moderation work, data labeling, the kinds of work that we might dismiss as piecework, click work. She kind of chanted to me, the money. The money, 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 money. And we literally both started kind of singing the Apprentice song. And so fairly striking to be with this woman who, if you met her in the street, she would be in full burqa. She has several children. She, for the most part, culturally is expected to stay in the home. And for her, this was an opportunity to feel economically engaged, that she was contributing to her household, that she was able to manage her life at home and her time caring for her kids with this experience of earning money. And I poked her on this. I'm like, this is a middle-class family. This is one of the groups we called regulars. This wasn't her main source of income, but it had value to her that I think we can probably all relate to if we've ever had to step out or never had a chance to enter a world of employment, that she felt this sense of identity from being able to do this work. And it wasn't about the money, it was about feeling productive.
Well, and you dig into the gender questions in the book in a way I thought was really profound. And, you've said before, the media didn't really know what to do with this book. Because here we read the title and we think, oh, this is a hit piece on Silicon Valley and taking on this kind of work as problematic, which you frame out its problematic nature, but you also talk about the role it's played in, allowing women who are expected to stay in the home to have some sense of economic freedom, what that's meant in their marriages, what that's meant in their identity. And so it is a really, you don't actually, feed into the narrative that the media wants to tell, the binary narrative. You're actually sort of painting a much more complex picture. Well, let's dig a little bit more into sort of where it ends and begins. Because it strikes me that a lot of what we're talking about is web-based work, right? The work that can happen anywhere across the globe. And feeds into a website and people can do it in their own homes. But then there's also the platform work that clearly has a human involved. When the Lyft comes to pick me up and the driver is in the front seat, and I obviously used the platform to call that person. So what are some of the differences and similarities in platform work? One that erases the human piece and one where the human is more central because it's more local.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think it's important to know that much of information services, that moment of a person showing up at your home, it also involves this back end, and think of it as back office work that's being done often by the task on contract. And when I say task, I mean there's a specific need that's going to be filled and then you're done, and it's a question of whether you're coming back or not. It's not that this is your career trajectory or your training. So in the case of calling up a ride-hailing app, Uber in particular is an interesting example that under that more visible labor you see of somebody showing up to take you somewhere, and all the work they might also be doing on their phone that is their own data work, there's this substrate that you can't see. So for example, Uber tested out Real ID Check, which is a way for you to verify who's your driver, who's going to come pick you up. We can have lots of discussion whether that's a valuable service or not. It's a service and consumers consume it. So when they're testing out and did expand that in different markets, there's an error rate. I mean, anybody who's worked with a computer, ever tried to print something, it doesn't happen 100% of the time. So there's a failure rate. And in cases where you can't easily identify that driver, and that's by the photo that's on file, being compared to a snapshot that a driver takes of themselves. In the intro of the book, we describe a moment of the kind of work that comes into play that you would not see, which is if there is an agreement between those two images, the one just taken and the one on file, it is literally shot anywhere around the world. It can be anywhere around the world. But somebody we interviewed, Aisha, talked about doing exactly this kind of work, where she's given seconds to be able to identify an image she's shown, the image that was just taken, and any auxiliary information she can gather to help her confirm, is this your driver? All she's seeing is a computer screen that shows her two different images, and she's being asked, is this the same person? That's well beyond what a computer can do. Software cannot see. It literally can only look at metadata, do some geometry. And so she is absolutely necessary for that ride to complete. If she can't confirm the identity of that driver, you're never going to know it because another driver is sent in that person's place. And just as importantly, the driver's account, it's suspended until they can reconfirm his identity or her identity. So this substrate, this moment of snap judgment is integral to that economic exchange. And yet you probably have no idea Aisha's out there doing this kind of work. And there is no effective way yet to be able to automate her work out.
That's interesting. When I first saw the title of this book, it made me think of the shadow economy, which is often a term related to the undocumented in America. And even farm workers and domestic laborers, who were left out of labor law, which you talk about in the book as well, have work that is similarly precarious. Ai-jen Poo, the visionary leader of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, says, domestic workers were the first gig workers. The conditions are very similar. So I'm curious how you thought about the body of workers that do not yet have technology as sort of an intermediary, but have existed in the informal space, since really the dawn of the country.
Yeah, and I think that was the value of having the comparison between India and the United States, is that it reminds us, and hopefully it brings the reader to an awareness, that the most of the world of economic activity is informal. So in India, it's an 85% cash economy. Most of the economy is a service-driven economy that's negotiated every day, often between private parties. We can lament that we haven't seen the expansion of formal employment. And again, as an anthropologist, I'm a pragmatist. I'm looking at, so what does that mean for people? Like, how do they navigate that? So in the India context, informality is the default. It makes no sense to talk about that somehow being exceptional. So how is it that people manage those relationships? And just as importantly, what are the infrastructure, what is the public sector work that goes in to trying to safeguard people in those economies? Most of our approach has been the safeguard has to come through formal employment. Statistically, we've really not made any moves to change that the reality is that most of that navigation is done private party to private party. So when I'm thinking about this, and I just recently finished a white paper with USAID on this topic, it's really seeing these technologies are now structuring informal economies globally. It's not formalizing them, although it is giving us a better way of being able to see who's participating. Is there wage theft involved? We literally can now track a lot of the things that can be incredibly harmful to the people who are most marginalized, undocumented workers, who have to worry about their personal safety and just being compensated for their work. So we could see these technologies as an intervention of actually being useful to people who are otherwise always navigating economic activity entirely on their own with no safety net. The question for me is, how can we look to the people who are navigating this world and not see them as a them that's so far off from our experience? But this world of work shows us this is office work 5 years from now. This isn't the future. This is what's happening to most contract work now. It's being turned further into project-based work. The reason this book is ultimately optimistic, some of it it's like, I'm a relentless optimist, but the other part of it is we see workers who are able to meet what are priorities for them through this work. They are diagnosing what is not working about formal employment.
Yeah. You have been at this a while, right? So this is 6 years in the making, the book. Yeah. And during that time, which you talked about in the intro, I think in the beginning, you probably told people at parties, oh, I'm writing a book on ghost work. And everybody was like, what are you talking about? That's algorithms, that's technology. But now I think, Casey Newton wrote this piece in The Verge, really exposing the role that content moderators have at Facebook and the PTSD people have, the lack of mental health services they have from seeing the underbelly of what's on the internet, as their job is to approve whether or not something can be posted. And even just this last week when Mark Zuckerberg was on the Hill testifying, one of the new members of Congress, Katie Porter, asked him really tough questions about whether or not he would go play the role of content moderator, which he didn't answer. So how does the knowledge of one particular type of ghost work and sort of the awareness that many of us have of that particular slice, how does that growing sort of impact your work and overall reception of the book and the work?
I mean, it's really interesting. Importantly, Casey Newton and other people reporting on this are pointing out the most egregious experiences that people are having. And I think the challenge for me is, after spending so many years doing this work, we met people who do this work day in, day out. So this woman, Kala, comes to mind. She does content moderation, content review. For her, she describes it as cleaning up the internet for her kids. So if any of you do work that, if you were an ER doctor, or you're a nurse, or you're taking care of psychiatric patients, I don't think any of us would look at your job and say, God, how can you do that? That's so ugly. It's necessary. And I think the reality is we kind of have two options here. We could all really stop using all of social media today. And that would stop the flood of content moderation that there is to do. Or we can accept that there are technical hard limits to being able to automate content review. And that means we're always going to have humans in the loop doing content moderation and review. It's arguably a new profession on the horizon, and we don't value it. We don't really know what to call it. It's a bit of a moving target because some of this content can be recognized. It might be something that could be automatically detected and removed. A lot of it, and think about just a good example of hate speech. If I use a word that otherwise might seem hateful, but between the two of us it's loving, there is absolutely no way to recognize that automatically because it's driven by context. It's, that we know each other. Those kinds of histories and realities, they're beyond programming. So you need a person able to evaluate. And again, it's not one person doing the evaluation. The mechanism here is have the wisdom of the crowd. Have hundreds of people you can show the same content and have them evaluate it. So one of the examples that we have in the book that I love to turn to, if I said the phrase binders full of women, okay? Many of us in the room might recognize what that phrase is. We have context to understand that phrase. If you're just trying to look at those words and make sense of them, they make no sense. They kind of barely made sense in the moment, right? So
they were a great Halloween costume.
They were great. Oh my gosh, yes.
A lot of binders.
Absolutely. And so that is a good example. The only way in real time you can capture what is going on with that, should it be trending on Twitter, is by having enough people that you can send that string of words and have them literally verify for you, what is this? Is this political speech? Is it hate speech? Is it nonsense? Is this, a DDoS attack? Is somebody trying to take down our website? So realizing that content review is with us for as long as we're going to be generating content as users, and then moving forward with what's horrific is not the work they're doing, it's that they're doing without care provided. That's kooky, right? I mean, that's the part that should horrify us. Not what they do, but that they're doing without support.
Well, and just to take this a step further, they are also not employees of Facebook. They are employees of a consulting firm to a consulting firm to a temporary staffing agency that does this work. And it sort of gets to the broader structural point you're making about the fissuring of the workplace and how so much of this work is tasked out in part in a long tradition of sort of the firm that used to once hold the job now sort of unbundling and the rise of temporary work, seasonal work, contracting work, none of which has access to care or benefits and protections that traditional employees in the US have. So I think the structural point and the micro point about the care, I think, are both part of the mix.
This is why ghost work isn't a particular kind of work. It's this work condition that's really coming from the collision of a social safety net that we built and put in place in the 30s and 40s. We literally built unemployment, workplace safety, retirement, all of the things that we put in place to protect the average worker. Assume often you're working at a work site, that you have one employer and you're negotiating with management, hopefully, through collective bargaining, and that you're going to be there the rest of your career. Those are literally the starting points for everything we have for a social safety net. And the challenge before us is that is colliding with the reality that implicit in that is we're talking about manufacturing, right? This is a world of service work and information work. We didn't build any labor laws around service work and information work. Arguably, we've historically been awful at valuing service work. How do we know that? We would not have the price point we have for teaching salaries, nurses, childcare, if the market was functionally pricing that labor akin to what it is they're caring for. So we know, we know we don't have good economic models for care work. We are literally driving most of our economy into information service work. And that, to me, is hopefully what this book points out, is that the reality of how much work we fissured. David Weil has a beautiful book called The Fissured Workplace that speaks to this. We dismantled full-time employment. I should be explicit, companies decided, let's cut costs. How do you do that? Create a supply chain where I'm not responsible for the people who are producing value for pieces of my company. We're left with that legacy. Attach it to contracts that last 2 minutes or 3 seconds, because each of these are basically running on short contract. And so it's that reality that we have to face.
Let's go back to the worker for a second. I think I get time for one more question, then we'll open it up to folks. I want to talk about identity of work that you see forming. You talk about the sort of manufacturing identity, that's built around the workplace and unions, the purpose that works provide, as well as the paycheck and the politics. Given that there's none of that, right? There's no water cooler, there is no workplace, and really no OSHA, right? No safety laws. What sort of new identities do you see forming in this part of the labor force? Yeah.
So, and I love this because one of the things that was most surprising to my co-author Siddharth Suri was so many people who turn to this world of work, they quickly go and find somebody else who does this work, and they form networks. And he was surprised by that because as somebody who builds these platforms, he thought, but they don't need to talk. Why would they talk, right? And there's a joke buried in there about engineers. So it turns out we talk at work for more reasons than to just get our work done. And so importantly, in terms of the identities that people build, it's really complicated in that we have myriad maps, mental maps, that come up from the structuring of this open call approach to labor. So what do I mean by that? When you create one of these platforms where you're literally saying, if any of you want to do a task, please sign up and you can get paid, it turns out it operates just like every other social network that we have out there. You've got a core group of people who are like, yes, yes, yes. We call them always on. They literally turn this into a full-time work stream. And whatever that income stream might be for them, they've decided for many reasons that are their priorities, this is what I'm going to do to make my money. And so their sense of identity is a bit different and can coalesce, and they actually do organize as workers who are doing a range of tasks. Sometimes they're identifying with the kinds of tasks they do. So two of the companies we studied, Amara and Lead Genius, the workers in those settings, because the platforms themselves really orient around the workers themselves, they value the workers, you can see that the workers themselves build out a sense of connection and identity as coworkers. So for Amara, it does captioning and language translation for video, and they identify as linguists. So you can see identities form there, but keep in mind, and I feel like this is so critical to our discussions about where to go with our policies and our social safety net, there's a core group of people, we call them regulars, who also answer that call and say, yeah, I'll do some tasks, I'll do some projects. They often will pick a couple hours or particular kinds of tasks. They stick with that routine. It's almost always, it's not about flexibility. I hate that formulation. It's about them dealing with constraints on their time. And so they are picking particular kinds of tasks and work hours, often around care for their children and their parents. And that's going to become more common when we get older, right? And they are necessary for this abundance. There's no way to have this market without that deep bench of regulars who can step in at any moment, and they can do exactly what an always-oner can do. And you as a consumer can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference between a driver who does a couple hours a week or a data labeler who does a couple hours a week and somebody who does 40. And then, to really make it complicated, there's this long tail of people who are experimenting, and we call them experimentalists. They are a good 70% of any of these platforms. This was 4 different platforms cutting across a myriad business models. They all had the same pattern. This 70%, they're doing 1 or 2 tasks. We met people who left these platforms where we were able to talk with them about why did you leave. For some of them, it's this is awful, it's isolating, bad pay, I can't figure it out. Importantly, they never found their way to those networks of always on. And they were like, peace out, I'm not doing this anymore. Guess what? They provide value because they literally swell the number of people you're going to see who can meet your immediate need as a consumer or business, and they're providing value, and then they're gone. And we've talked about this, that is economically, we call it churn. And it's the sign typically of an unhealthy market. We don't know what to do with markets that actually rely on people moving through, experimenting, providing 1 or 2 tasks, and moving out. And those regulars who are necessary, but not there all the time, and those always-oners who are absolutely core, because they're picking up 70%, 80% of the productivity. We have to organize a safety net that captures all of those people, because they're all necessary.
To be clear, our safety net's all or nothing. You work 40 hours and you have access to paid leave, contributions to retirement, healthcare, or nothing. There's nothing, yes, kind of, but there's no proration in between. So what is on your minds for Mary? I think there's some mics out in the
Hi,
audience.
so we're just about to open this up to questions.
Great.
We just ask that you please frame your question as a question and speak into the mic so we can get to as many people as possible. So we have 2 circulating. Any questions?
Right, we have one over here.
Thank you. Do you understand ghost work as a product of neoliberalism specifically, or do you understand it using a different framework?
That's a really great question, because I think in many ways, as somebody who feels like that term can capture so much that it means it's kind of become empty, that I think it is a state of late capitalism that's consumer driven. And I think importantly, when we're thinking about service markets and any market that's effectively trying to capture consumer taste, that we could and should bring a critique to that expansion, what that looks like. I think for me, again, as somebody who's ethnographically invested in what it is that people do, I recognize people are making their work lives meaningful. So I'm concerned and really consumed with if that work is happening, and particularly if I think of maybe the markets I'm less fond of, like social media markets, and I think healthcare. Healthcare as a service is absolutely necessary. There isn't a world in which, again, if you take to heart the argument of this book, there is no technical solution to care work that involves touching and holding another human's body. Not because robots will squish you, but literally because AI can't anticipate, it doesn't have enough data to tell it, what do I do next? And mostly that's because until this changes, humans expect connection. There is no doing next, it's being there. It's literally being present. And so in that case, would I think it an expression of neoliberalism to see what comes of service markets that are about care, that involve project task-based work? I would say, I would reframe it and try to imagine what are the work conditions under which care work is valued. And can capitalism sustain that value? That's a great question. I don't think it has to be capitalism, but it certainly in terms of work has to be about recognizing the collective aggregated value of people being available to each other.
But in the book, you talk about how in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, there were jobs that they gave to children specifically because their small bodies could fit into places that, you couldn't otherwise, a worker couldn't otherwise do, and that was okay.
Yes.
Until, and it was okay in that capitalism until we as a government said, this is not okay. Right. Children are not allowed in factories. We will regulate the workday. Many of you sort of said a driver who drives 4 hours or 40 hours. There are also the long tail of drivers who drive 80 hours. It is part of their economic calculation. We as a society have said we don't want that happening in the formal workplace. So all that to say, there, in the historical moments you talk about, we through bloody battles remedied that for some workers. There's still, I think, a really important race piece here where a lot of work that was done by people of color and women were left out. So it's an interesting question that we've been here before as a nation. We've fixed it for some. And
this has helped me realize what's neoliberal is that we keep looking for a market solution. So what we should all be recognizing, and thanks for connecting that point, is that we've never had a moment in labor history, in the history of employment, where the market solved work conditions. We have always had to frame it as a social question, a fundamental social question. How do we want to proceed in valuing each other? To your point, it wasn't because children somehow just stopped being useful at clearing looms. That's not what happened. And in fact, that we still have the persistent problem of children doing work around the world without compensation or care. We can have a conversation about what would that look like, and we don't, because we are constantly reaching for what's the market solution. So I'm really, thank you for bringing that point up, because if we could all leave this room and realize there is no market solution to the kind of work we're describing, it will take redefining what are the ways we want private sector, public sector, and workers themselves to come to this world of work? What do we want to expect of each other?
Hi. Thank you so much for your work. Part of it struck me that the fracturing of businesses and ghost work are described as a reality. Just to challenge that assumption a bit, why would it be impossible to regulate those things out of existence, or why shouldn't we?
And actually, that's a great question, because I feel like it needs to be regulated. So let me say that just full stop. It absolutely desperately needs regulation. So for example, the couple of companies that I mentioned, Amara and Lead Genius, who become in many ways models of, well, how would you orient to doing this work that really centers the value of the worker rather than the value of the software? And in that case, they are looking for regulation, something to give them guardrails, precisely so that if somebody comes in and wants to offer captioning and translation work and drops the cost so low, and you will always find people who will pick up that work, that we demonize them for picking up the work is the hard part for me to understand, but there will be people who effectively create competition. It makes no sense not to approach this as, well, we need a floor then. We should make sure that there's a baseline of pay. So it's not to say this shouldn't be regulated. The question is the regulatory move, well, everybody should really be a full-time employee? That's the place where I want to bring the empirical evidence we have, says there's no way to organize labor markets of an open call that really rely on this Pareto distribution of folks who are always on regulars and experimentalists that are necessary to give you that abundance, that literally you wouldn't be able to supply this demanding world of task-based work without being able to have that distribution, as far as we can tell. That's the part. How do we regulate and create support for that kind of work? Why do we insist on to basically say we need an employer to set a schedule? Because there's no way to turn this into full-time work without then compelling the business to say, well, I have a limited number of people. I now need to schedule them because I need somebody who's going to be there at 3 a.m. And that's a crappy shift. And so being able to imagine what does it look like to make sure that everybody who's providing value, because again, it's not the person who's just delivering the service, it is that at any point you can find many people to do it. So I want to give an illustration of this because I find it helpful. If you think about any time you've ever opened any of these apps, and if you were opening up one app and you saw, oh, there's like 6, I'm going to use cars, because most people can visualize that. There are 6 cars who could take me to the airport in 5 minutes. It's reassurance. You can shut your app and you can say, okay, I can finish taking care of what I was doing with my kid. If you open up the other app and it's got 1 or 2, which of those 2 companies are you likely to go with and why? And check your gut, because that's the place where as consumers, we're not paying our fair share to value what we're getting in that moment. So that's the place where I'd say the regulation needs to come in recognizing the value proposition of these labor markets is the abundance, it's the commons. How do we pay for it?
Questions? We have one at center.
But one of the things you pointed out is that this is an international market. The commons is not just here in the United States.
Yeah.
So how do we regulate across countries?
Yeah. So this is calling the question on what we call a business model, which is go find somebody who's cheaper elsewhere. And I think we've been allowing that to be a model, a business model, a viable business model, and avoiding that question of, in cases where it is an international labor market, what do we do? That's making it sound as though we don't live in a world that's an international labor market. So the production of these information services hinges on a long, what we call an AI labor supply chain. So the driver who's picking somebody up, who's dependent on the worker somewhere else, who could be anywhere else, but may very well be in another country, perhaps because of the hour. We could have myriad reasons you have somebody in another location. They're equally dependent on each other. And the company is equally dependent on that supply chain that spreads around the world. How do we regulate that? It is genuinely saying, for the multinationals that seem to have figured out how to make money across the world, how they would distribute money across the world. And in some cases, we can be very pragmatic here. There's a clear, for the online to offline kind of information services, it's often a local market, localization of a service that's happening that you can regulate on the municipal level. You can set very clear rules. We don't have to have one size fits all here. In cases where you know a multinational is effectively extracting value from a global supply chain of workers, what can we do to make sure there's a fair distribution? And literally thinking, why am I paying somebody less in a city like Bangalore that is as expensive as New York City? Why would I be thinking the pricing would be different? That's the place where we get stuck in thinking, oh, the market should have a solution for this. No, I think it's going to be regulating the amount of profit that multinationals are making by not paying any task-based, project-based worker their fair share.
We have time for just one more question, and then you are welcome to join us for a book signing out in the lobby. Oh, I see one right here.
Hello, thank you for your time today. I'm hopeful in some of the potential benefits of a universal basic income to sort of overcome the hodgepodge of insurance programs, cash transfers. But what are two of the most dangerous ways to incorrectly implement a universal basic income?
God, Natalie should take that question. I will say one thing, and I would really love to hear Natalie's response to this, is in the book we actually talk about universal basic income. I'm going to do a caricature here. Often when we think, if I say that, and particularly when some of it's being thrown about in national debates, what I hear is, it's so sad that there are people who are going to get run over by the robots. They don't have much education. We should give them some money so they don't get mad at us. That's kind of the tone of a lot of universal basic income. And what troubles me is that for the workers that we interviewed who participated in this research, this is thousands of workers, we interviewed hundreds of workers in person and sat with many of them for almost 2 years, none of them are interested in that framing. They don't feel pitiful. They are quite aware that they're making a calculus. Often they're thinking, well, the service job that's pretty much available to me readily to work 9 to 5 and to hear about what shift I might have a week or 2 weeks from now, and I'm going to have to commute into a city because I can't afford to live in that city. That's actually more expensive to me than if I do this work from home. Like, they're running the numbers. So in that case, what frustrates me about the framing of universal basic income is it's letting technology companies and all the companies that are relying on information service workers off the hook. They are dependent on this commons, on this workforce. They're we have built our economy around a dependency on contingent work. That doesn't have to be a bad thing if we're valuing contingent work. And so the challenge for me is, and the argument we make in the book is, let's think of it for what it is. It's a retainer. We know how to talk about retainers when we talk about doctors or lawyers, and that is pretty much culturally loaded. We say, well, I want to be able to get this lawyer at any time, so I better pay a retainer to their practice. We could absolutely bring the same logic to thinking about why would you have a baseline of pay that makes sure you have particular workers who have a specific kind of capacity available all the time. And then when I really call the question, the very beginning of my presentation, well, any work that can't be done by technology, that's going to be the most vital work. So wouldn't you want to make sure you could access anyone, make sure all of the people who are working age could be available to this commons? So it's really to rethink, what is our attitude? Do we think those other people need basic income? Or do we see the value of retaining all working adults so that they can come in and out of this market and be available to ourselves and to each other and to businesses? That's a very different way of framing it. And I think it could be very poorly implemented if it's treated as though there's some basic amount of money you could provide people to quell their anger at the injustice of inequality.
I totally agree. I was delighted, actually, to read, as somebody who's thought about a universal basic income or a guaranteed income for years now, I was delighted to read your framing of a retainer, because I think that is just spot on. You know, in our research, the idea of giving people money or a handout or free money, it really didn't resonate with anyone up and down the political spectrum and the income spectrum. People want to feel valued, and those frames don't work. I think that, to me, the biggest mistake is to predicate the argument for an income floor on the future. Like, in the future, a set of things might happen to the workforce, and ignore its radical legacy in social justice here in the United States. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for a guaranteed income in his last book, Where We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, when he looked around and saw 50 million people living in poverty. 50 years later, there's 50 million people living in poverty, and we've had a 50-year transformation in our economy from a middle-class sort of industrial capitalism to a service capitalism, and wages during that time just stayed stagnant. You know, you have half of American families who could not come up with $400 in an emergency if they needed to, given the financial instability in people's lives, the debt they hold because of skyrocketing costs. Like, to me, those are the reasons to make the case for radically thinking about, you know, big ideas like creating an income floor for everyone and not predicating it on the rise of the robot. So I really feel like, Mary, to kind of close it up, that's the theme of your book, is that, you know, the robots are not coming to take our jobs. The humans are behind this work and have always been throughout history. And we forget that at our peril, so.
At all of our peril. And I think that's, at the end of the day, it's saying work is a transaction. And so how do we make sure that transaction is sharing and recognizing the value? And this is calling the question on how little we've really been able to come at that question without loading it with a lot of cultural assumptions about who we should value, who we don't, and why. And that's what I hope we leave you with, is that to really rethink this. This is literally an opportunity to rethink, how do we value care and service to each other, work that helps someone else. And it's not out of charity, it's literally, I've generated value for you, so what are we going to give each other in exchange?
Well, thank you so much for your work, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.